I'm as mild-mannered as can be, and I've never done them.
On the 15th of May 1942, the body of a 60-year-old Manhattan waterfront worker was found in New York's Hudson River. The body was that of Matti Valentin Poikahuta, better known by his pen name T-Bone Slim, a prolific columnist, poet, and songwriter for the publications of the Radical Industrial Works of the World Union, also known as the Wobblies. Much like an earlier Wobbly, Joe Hill, who was framed for murder and eventually executed in 1915, Slim's work gained great popularity within the workers' movement and hobo jungle camps. But unlike Joe Hill, who became a folk hero after his death, Slim has since been unfairly forgotten by the movement to which he dedicated so much of his life and subsequently faded into almost total obscurity. This is working class literature.
He was breathing rather hard when he saw my Union card. He went wild, simply wild over me.
Welcome to the first episode of the Working Class Literature podcast. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the life and work of IWW author T-Bone Slim. If you'd like to learn more about the IWW, you should check out our sister podcast, Working Class History, whose episodes 6 and 9 cover IWW history from 1905 to 1950. In this episode, we speak to Dr Owen Clayton and John Westmoreland, who've been conducting research on T-Bone Slim.
Hi, my name is Dr Owen Clayton. I'm a senior lecturer in English literature at the University of Lincoln in the UK. I'm currently working on a book entitled On and Off the Road, The Writings of Vagabonds, Tramps and Hobos. So I'm interested in transiency and the writings of transients and also the music and the culture of transiency, particularly in America, but in other countries as well.
My name is John Westmoreland. I'm from Pittsburgh, North Carolina, and I'm a musician and songwriter who recently found out that T-Bone Slim is my great-granduncle.
The intro music to this episode was John's version of Slim's The Popular Wobbly, which we'll be playing more of later on. You can also find out more information about John's music in the show notes below. Slim grew up in America's notoriously left-wing working-class Finnish community at the end of the 19th century. He married his wife Rosa and had 4 children before leaving his family and becoming a hobo, working numerous jobs as he would until the end of his life.
T-Bone Slim was a second-generation Finnish immigrant. He was born on Valentine's Day, so the 14th of February, 1882. And he was born and raised in a working-class family in Ashtabula in Ohio. It was known as Finntown. He worked there in the harbor along with his father and brothers. The family moved to Erie, Pennsylvania, around about the turn of the century. And then Slim worked in the harbor in Erie as well, along with members of his family. He was a hoister, so he was hoisting goods and freight on and off ships. He married in 1902. He married his wife, Rosa. They had 4 children. And then we don't know exactly why, but in 1912, he left the family and he became a hobo or a transient worker. And 3 years later, Rosa successfully filed for divorce. So there's this kind of mysterious period in his life after 1912, pretty much the next 8 years. We don't exactly know what he did really for most of between 1912 and 1920. He articles that he wrote later in the industrial worker newspapers suggest he did all kinds of jobs, much like many hobos would have done. He was a lumberjack. He was a Gandhi dancer, which meant that he was putting down railroad ties. There's a couple of accounts of him working as a cook. One account in Oregon as a camp cook, and also a harvest laborer as well. So he did all kinds of jobs and led this kind of hobo life for a large part of his early life, particularly once he left his family.
As with everything with T-Bone Slim, there's more gaps than there are bridges to the past there. There's a story that he was working for a Duluth newspaper and did a was covering an IWW meeting, and that he wrote his article on the meeting and then submitted it to the editor at the newspaper, and that they botched up the story, and that he was furious, and that he quit then and then joined the IWW. But it's there's I don't, unless we find there I haven't found any articles from any Duluth newspaper. I don't know of any newspaper that he worked for other than the IWW. Although I guess it certainly could be possible. It's hard to say. So that's a story that's been passed around, just as that's what there is with T-Bone Slim, is there's stories and you can believe whatever you want to.
We don't know whether he became radicalized as a result of being a hobo, or whether he became a hobo as a result of being radicalized. We don't really know. Certainly, in terms of his background, Finnish immigrants had a reputation for being, fairly left-wing. So it's entirely possible he could have encountered radical ideas, growing up in Ashtabula and Ohio, or, encountered wobblies and hobos kind of moving through those towns. At some point in between 1912 and 1920, it seems to me that he would have joined the IWW. And around about 1920 is also when his articles first starting appearing in the Industrial Worker newspaper. And the Industrial Worker newspaper was the IWW. It was their main weekly outlet as well. And what we do know, we don't necessarily know a huge amount about when he became a wobbly. But what we do know from his articles is that he was a pretty committed wobbly. He's very committed to the kind of wobbly vision of worker self-emancipation. And this not only did that put him at odds with mainstream American capitalist society, but it also put him at odds with the Communist Party and the Leninist, Stalinist Communist Party, and also with the Socialist Party of America as well, and both of those kind of parties believed in having a kind of educated vanguard that were going to show the workers the path to emancipation. And Slim makes it quite clear that he's pretty scathing about that idea. So he didn't hold an official position in a union, a kind of high up committee position or anything like that. He was a long-term member of the Wobblies and other unions as well. There are accounts of him taking part in meetings. I think he was, doing that as an ordinary member, presumably in relation to matters that were affecting him as a worker, right? So, from the 30s onwards, he was working on the Manhattan waterfront. So, there are accounts of him, attending meetings, going to union halls. So I think he was active in that sense, but not necessarily as a leader in the organizing sense. But he was certainly friends with organizers. So there's an account of him being friends with the prominent African American wobbly organizer Ben Fletcher in New York. Slim and Fletcher seem to have been friends. But in terms of how significant Slim was, he was extremely significant. His main contribution are the newspaper articles that he writes. So he writes weekly columns in the Industrial Worker, and he writes occasional pieces in One Big Union Monthly as well. His work is also reprinted in Industrial Solidarity. So, he's featured across a range of wobbly papers, and the Industrial Worker columns in particular, they appear almost every week for over 20 years. So from 1920 to his death in 1942. So he really was a very prolific prose writer. And we know that he was that people were reading him. We know that radicals and that hobos and other workers were reading him. There are accounts of people saying that they only bought the Industrial Worker newspaper in order to read his column. And in fact, there's even an advert for one of those papers that says there's a lot more in Industrial Solidarity and Industrial Worker than T-Bone Slim's columns. Which shows that, they were aware that people were only buying those papers to read him. He was definitely their best writer, and they knew it. There are accounts of workers, sailors, exchanging Slim's phrases and aphorisms amongst each other. It kind of reminds me of, how like a worker today might, like watch a comedy and then the next day they would be saying lines from that comedy at work, that kind of thing. And there's even an account of hobos writing Slim's sayings onto boxcars. And then, obviously those boxcars would then travel all around the United States. So, giving him a kind of physical circulation. And one wobbly writer even refers to Slim as the laureate of the logging camps. So he was, he really was well known, very significant. There were actually anonymous poems written in his honor and published in the Industrial Worker as well. So he did have this kind of legendary status really amongst the Wobblies in the 20s and 30s in particular.
He seemed to be the IWW's most prolific columnist, during his active years of writing from 1920 until his death in 1942, excuse me. But so I would say as a writer, he was quite prolific. And there was Carl Cowell, who was at one time a member of the IWW and I think later became a member of the Communist Party, was quoted as saying that he was a real adjunct of the paper, and that he thought that a lot of people used to buy the Industrial Worker just to read T-Bone Slim. And he'd say that you used to hear in the jungles the latest remarks that T-Bone Slim had made. But he also went on to say that he was not often quoted in the non-IWW radical press because he was popular, and the impulse would be not to give credence or notoriety to a competitor. So he was a positive feature of an opponent movement. So that's from Carl Cowell, from an interview that was taped with Franklin Rosemont in 1983. This is from the same interview. Carl stated that in regards to T-Bone Slim's writing, some of it was frankly obscure. I don't know what the hell he was trying to say. He dredged it up from the bottoms of his psyche.
And I guess his other contribution are his songs. And if people have heard of Slim today, which they often haven't, to be honest, but if they have, they may have encountered one or two of his songs. So there's a few that are still in circulation today. There's one called Mysteries of a Hobo's Life, which has been recorded by Cisco Houston. There's the Lumberjack's Prayer. It's been covered by a few people. There's even a Studs Terkel version. And the Popular Wobbly is probably his most well-known song. That's been covered by Pete Seeger and others. And Slim's songs, much like the far more famous Joe Hill, Slim's songs were published in the Industrial Worker newspaper, and with the aim that hobos and transient workers would sing them, would carry those newspapers with them on freight trains, and then would sing those songs around, jungle campfires and on jobs. Unfortunately, as far as we're aware, he doesn't seem to have recorded any of his songs. The technology certainly did exist at the time that, in theory, he might have recorded something. I've never heard of such a recording. And there is even an article I've read where he's very scathing of radio. And it kind of refers to it as a form of scabbing, which makes me think that he may have not wanted to record. There are accounts of him, giving kind of benefit concerts and live gigs. I do actually have in front of me an account of him performing on stage in New York City, which is quite, I think is quite entertaining. So this is a very rare account. We don't have many of these. And this comes from a book called Second String Red, The Life of Al Lannon, American Communist. Hoping to capitalize on lingering IWW sentiment among seamen, Al Lannon set up an open-air meeting at Thames and Broadway, featuring T-Bone Slim. Lannon gave the singer a big introduction, expecting the singer to open with his well-known Popular Wobbly. T-Bone Slim began yelling at the crowd about those fucking bastards down in Alabama who had framed the Scottsboro Boys. An embarrassed Lannon hustled the living legend away from the microphone. So the Scottsboro Boys case was an infamous miscarriage of justice in American history, in which African American men were sharing a freight car with white women. They were basically busted by a railroad cop or a bull And the white women, I think partly as a way of protecting themselves, made what in all likelihood was a trumped up allegation of sexual assault, basically. So they kind of used their white privilege as a way of getting themselves out of trouble in this interracial boxcar that they'd been in. And it was this very famous, miscarriage of justice. It was a very poorly handled trial. And which went and that case kind of went on for years and was a bit of a kind of cause célèbre on the left and in the early 20th century United States. So I've read a lot of hobo autobiographies, and while many of them are interesting and in some respects admirable, there are also a significant portion of hobo writers who are basically white supremacists. And yet here we have an account of somebody at the same time who is blindingly angry about a shameful moment of racial injustice from American history, right? And obviously that also fits in with the account we have of his interracial friendship with Ben Fletcher. So I think Slim comes off fairly well. I think we also get a bit of a sense of his personality, right, and shouting at the audience. And I also love the quote because, it might very well be that Slim was one of the first ever musicians to refuse to sing his greatest hit on stage, which obviously lots of musicians since him have done.
One of the central themes that comes up frequently in Slim's writing is that of food, or rather its lack thereof, both in terms of quantity and quality.
So he's super political, as you'd expect for a wobbly. The thing he writes the most about, and his name is a bit of a giveaway here, is food. So he sees food and hunger as being a kind of defining class experience. So one of his phrases, he says, "Labor has a bad habit of getting hungry." Right, but by which he means that workers are kind of betrayed by their stomachs into performing, exploitative labor. Right, without getting hungry, people might not, agree to do this labor. He talks a lot about how workers eat, very infrequently. He says that mealtime is an epoch in the history of today. That it's a really significant event in the life of workers. The hunger of the workers is what, for him, is what defines them as workers. And at one point, he says that to appreciate his humor, readers should skip a couple of meals before reading him. And he's aware that actually a lot of his readers actually were hungry a lot of the time. He wrote a pamphlet, a kind of longer pamphlet, in addition to the various articles that he wrote. He also wrote a pamphlet, an expose of the food industry in the early 1920s, and he called that "Starving Amidst Too Much." Which I think, kind of highlights, that for him, the matter of food is a really political matter. And he doesn't just talk about like the quantity of food. He also talks about the quality of food as well. So in that pamphlet, he gets very angry about the marketing of cheap processed food for the working class, which was something that was really just starting to take off during his lifetime. And Slim was one of the first people to really pick up on that shift that was starting to take place. And, one of his songs, The Lumberjack's Prayer, is all about that.
The following track is a recording of Studs Terkel performing a reading of The Lumberjack's Prayer. Thanks to Bucky Hawker for giving us permission to use this version, which appears on his album Don't Want Your Millions. Check out the links in the show notes for more information.
The Lumberjack's Prayer by an old wobbly named T-Bone Slim. I pray, dear Lord, for Jesus' sake, give us this day a T-bone steak. Hallowed be thy holy name, and don't forget to send the same. Oh, hear my humble cry, O Lord, and send us down some decent board, brown gravy and some German fried, with sliced tomatoes on the side. Oh, hear my cry, almighty host, I quite forgot the quail on toast. Let your kindly heart be stirred, and stuff some oysters in that bird. Dear Lord, you know your holy wish. On Friday we must have fish. Our flesh is weak and spirit stale. You better make that fish a whale. Oh, hear me, Lord. Remove those dogs, those sausages of powdered logs, your bully beef hash and bearded snouts. Take them to hell or thereabouts. With alum bread and pressed beef butts, dear Lord, you damn near ruined my guts. You whitewash milkin', oleorine, I wish to Christ I'd never seen. Oh, hear me, Lord, I'm praying still, but if you won't, our union will. Put pork chops on the bill of fare, and starve no workers anywhere.
So the Lumberjack's Prayer is a song that follows in the, I suppose you'd say the tradition of Joe Hill's Preacher and the Slave. It's a parody of religion. The IWW often saw groups like the Salvation Army and other religious groups as kind of rivals. So it parodies religion as kind of promising, what Joe Hill referred to as pie in the sky, but doesn't actually deliver in the real world. It's got lots of different foodstuffs in it, which T-Bone talks about a lot in his writings. You've got T-bone steaks, you've got, ham and eggs, quail on toast, and so on. But I think one thing that the song Lumberjack's Prayer does do that develops on from Joe Hill is it also critiques adulterated food, which is something that is kind of distinctive about Slim. So it critiques hot dogs, it critiques alum bread, this kind of food that's, packed full of preservatives. Alum is a kind of aluminium-based compound which was just used to, bulk up bread to make people think they were full, but it actually, wasn't actually full of any nutrients, so your body wasn't getting what it needed, and actually was also related to cancer and other things, and had been used since the 19th century. And Slim says in the Lumberjack's Prayer that this food has damn near ruined his guts, which is quite likely to be true. He talks about olearine. Olearine is basically the original term for margarine. So olearine contains oil. Okay, another preserved food that's a kind of replacement for real food, which is butter. And Slim, being a cook, of course, he would know that butter is much better for you than margarine. In terms of the kind of context for the Lumberjack's Prayer, it was printed as basically a fundraising device on these cards that the IWW would put out. So they would try and sell these cards. They were 10 cents. They said that the payment, the money for these cards would go out and pay for the free literature that the IWW would put out. So there was, Slim was being used as somebody who could, write an entertaining song that would make people laugh, make a political point, but also be used to fundraise as well. And one thing that in the various recorded versions, including the Studs Terkel version of the Lumberjack's Prayer, that is on the cards but isn't actually in the recorded versions, that Slim did also write what he called an answer to the prayer, right? So he sets this prayer up as a kind of mock, prayer to God, which is kind of ironic given that he's a wobbly and critical religion. But then he writes this answer to the prayer. And that's just a prose piece, and it's just a few sentences. And so at the bottom of the prayer, Slim writes this. He says, "I am happy to say this prayer has been answered by the old man himself. He tells me he has furnished plenty for all, and that if I am not getting mine, it's because I am not organized sufficiently strong to force the master to loosen up. He tells me he has no knowledge on dogs, pressed beef butts, etc., and that they are probably products of the devil. He further informs me that capitalists are children of his'n, the devils that is, and that he absolutely refuses to participate in any children's squabbles. He believes in letting us fight it out along the lines of industrial unionism. Yours in faith, T-Bone Slim." So even in this answer to the prayer, you've got God kind of answering and saying, well, basically, I'm not going to get involved. You need to work it out for yourselves, which very much fits with, the final lines of the prayer itself, where Slim says, "Oh, hear me, Lord, I'm praying still. But if you won't, our union will put pork chops on the bill of fare and starve no workers anywhere." That God isn't going to provide the answer. You have to do it for yourselves, and you have to do it, in T-Bone Slim's opinion, through the IWW.
Another interesting thing about the Lumberjack's Prayer is how it mixes the modest with the luxurious, evident in how the humble cry for decent board quickly becomes a request for quail on toast stuffed with oysters. Slim is obviously playing around here, but the point he's making is also a serious one.
we want bread, but we want oysters too, or something like that, right? And it's and yeah, when he's exaggerating, he says, dear Lord, we know your holy wish. On Friday we must have a fish. Our flesh is weak and spirit stale. You better make that fish a whale. So he's using this kind of comic exaggeration to make exactly that point. Well, we don't want just a fair share. We want the whole thing, and we deserve the whole thing because we make it all.
Slim's prose writing was also very different from that of other essayists, particularly left-wing ones. So while, for instance, Orwell would go on to lay down his rules to prevent bad writing, like never use a long word where a short one will do, and if it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out, Slim, on the other hand, constructed a style of what he called coagulated verbosity. This involved mixing slang and workers' speech patterns with absurdist wordplay, sometimes through small neologisms where he fuses two words or ideas to create a new one, or otherwise in more extended passages.
I guess what I would say is perhaps most significant, though, about Slim is that he combines this accessibility with this amazing talent for absurdist wordplay. So, it's really clear from his writing that he was obsessed with words. Yeah, he turns words around, he shifts them about, he makes them into something new. But I suppose, I'd say even more significant is when he does it in more extended passages as well. And it almost, starts to break down meaning in quite, interesting and experimental ways. So to give you a bit of context for this one, this comes from 1923. And he's responding, as he often does, to a mainstream newspaper in which the newspaper has argued that abundance means prosperity. So then Slim picks up on that idea, and he says this: "Never has there been a shortage of abundance in these United States. Rather, it has been a case of too much abundance, and too much is not enough. Too much is too much, just what it says, and enough is less than too much. Too much is more than enough, and enough is never too much. Sufficiency isn't too much, but it is enough. So, you can see yourself. Enough is enough, and too much is too much. Abundance is too much and not enough. Hence, it is a very ambiguous quantity to monkey with. Better stick to sufficiency, be it ever so elegant." And it's all kind of there in that absurd paragraph, right? I mean, he's making these straightforward statements like, enough is less than too much. Well, yeah, of course it is. Who would disagree with that? But then as those statements go on, something else starts to happen. What Slim is doing here is putting that word abundance under pressure and putting it through a dialectical process. And so that when he concludes abundance is too much and not enough, what he's saying is abundance provides too much for the bourgeois class and not enough for the working class, right? Which is why he says that abundance is a very ambiguous quantity to monkey with. So he's translating very complex ideas here into language that's funny, accessible, and absurd. And he does that without losing the complexity of the ideas. And I think that's a remarkable achievement.
Also evident in Slim's writing is the breadth of his own reading, frequently peppering his columns with references to a variety of authors and poets.
As a reader, he's often making references to other writers. So he references Keats a lot. He rephrases sayings by Keats. He references Shakespeare. He kind of plays with Shakespeare's name at times, and he compares himself on at least two occasions to George Bernard Shaw. And he says, some people want to coax George Bernard Shaw, the world's other great writer, into this country, but the country isn't big enough for both of us, he says. And I think I get the impression that, although again he's being sarcastic, that he does actually like George Bernard Shaw. That's pretty clear from what he's saying.
Slim's writing also contains many parallels with modernism, which was arguably the most significant literary movement in America at the time in which Slim was active.
He does make oblique reference to literary modernists at one point. He refers to the modernists as the rising generation of poets, which, does suggest at least a degree of familiarity with modernism as well. I don't have any kind of biographical evidence of him reading modernists, but I think if you just look at his writing, I think you can see, that he is being influenced by that. So, and a common, modernist technique is defamiliarization, right? So, making the familiar seem unfamiliar, right? So making readers look again at something that they've, seen for a long time and taken for granted. And, and Slim does this with words in particular, words and ideas. He likes to kind of reframe words and ideas so that his readers can see them as ideological. He also experiments with language in ways that, can feel very modernist. So, he reproduces a yawn in print at one point. I'd love to be able to read that, but I can't because it's a mixture of random letters and punctuation marks, right? So it's completely unpronounceable, right? So you can only see it on a page. You can't actually speak it. There are also proto kind of surrealist moments. So he, at one point, one article, he talks to a woman whose body has completely disappeared except for a pair of red lips. And there's also another article where he has this long extended conversation throughout the entire article with a sentient stone that is in a prison wall, and the stone's kind of on strike. So these kind of surreal moments, and also in terms of him playing with words, he does this in quite extended ways. There's one article where he reproduces words that rhyme with omp until they just become kind of meaningless. He does something similar in another article with the word soup. I think at those moments, I would say that, he comes quite close to the writing of Gertrude Stein. I've no idea whether he read Stein. It's kind of hard to see him liking someone like Gertrude Stein, but, it comes quite similar to that. I think partly, this is like how he thinks, right? He thinks in not necessarily a straightforward way. But, I think it's partly also because, he sees his readers as being intelligent, right? He knows he's writing for a working class audience. He's writing for workers. He's writing for hobos. He's writing for radicals. And, those are groups who are kind of stereotyped in American society at that time as being basically brutes. As being unintelligent. And at one point he says, I am not in the habit of associating with ignoramuses, he says. I think, he wrote in this experimental way, but he did it in a way that meant that, his audience, his working class audience, could still understand him. He didn't lose them.
Perhaps due in part to the strong parallels with modernism, Slim's writing can also be read as an example of what French theorist Roland Barthes called the writerly text.
So Barthes' concept of the writerly text is a self-conscious literary text, a text that asks its readership to do a significant amount of work, right? So a text that asks his readers to be, I guess you'd say, active participants in the process of making meaning. So a really kind of obvious example of a writerly text is Ulysses, right? It's not just a book you can just open easily and breeze your way through. It takes work. And I think, we often, associate, I guess, modernism with, with potentially with right-wing politics and elitism. But, I think for Slim, Slim is, he's always trying to make his readers into active participants, because, he thinks that what bourgeois writing, like writers like Arthur Brisbane are doing, is that they're doing the opposite, right? They're trying to stop their readers from thinking, and they're certainly trying to stop their readers from taking any action after they've thought, which is where I guess you also get into questions around propaganda. The new words that he creates are, to me, an example of making readers work, albeit in a very quick way, because you can't understand. He's created this new word by combining the two ideas inherent in two other words. Well, you can't understand that new word unless you put those two ideas together yourself, right? So you have to do a little bit of work in order to create that. And he does that in a way that isn't, it's not elitist, right? You don't have to have a Harvard education to be able to do that, but you do need to put in some work. And and the same goes, I suppose, for the proto-surrealist and modernist elements of his work that we were just discussing as well. I think it's partly about making his readers work. And for him, I think there is that link between politics and writing for him. So he's like constantly exhorting his readers to overthrow capitalism, right? And he's constantly saying, that you can't rely on political leaders to do that for you, right? Because political leaders will always betray you. And for him, the same goes for kind of literary leaders. So he says, this is a quote from Slim. He says, "A man is only great as a writer if his readers are great. Never was, is, or will be a writer greater than reader." So for him, greatness is communal. It's a kind of communal model of authorship. It's greatness is it's a relationship between writer and reader. It's not a quality of individual genius. So if his readers are great, then he is also great. And earlier on, he also says, no one recognizes better than T-Bone Slim the insignificant magnitude of the world's greatest writer. So, if he's on his own, if he's taken as an individual writer, then his greatness it's an insignificant magnitude, which is a really interesting phrase. So, yeah, that kind of communal model of authorship. That's why, in the article I've described his style as literary anarchism.
Since finding out about his great-granduncle's career as a poet and songwriter, John Westmoreland has been working on readapting some of Slim's music.
Yeah, I pretty much right away started working on his songs. The first one I was the popular Wobbly or Wild Over Me, because that one was so readily available online. And yeah, I mean, I was just drawn to doing it because I'm a musician and songwriter. It seemed like the obvious thing to do to me at the time. And yeah, so I've been taking his songs and poems that I've found in either online or ones that are unpublished, and the material I found at my parents' house, as well as songs that are in the Newberry Library. And so yeah, so far I've really got, I guess, three of his songs that I perform publicly now. And there's other ones that I'm still kind of working on. My hope is to do a full length record of T-Bone Slim songs sometime, hopefully I'd like to have it out in the next year, is my hope. And basically my process with that is that I'm taking his lyrics and then I'm allowing myself liberties to musically express things how I feel drawn to doing so, as far as the chords and melodies that I use. So my version of the popular Wobbly is it's a bit different than the more just standard version of it.
We're going to play John's version of the popular Wobbly in just a second, but first it's interesting to note the song's trajectory from the popular 1917 show tune, which Slim was originally parodying, to Candy Carawan's readaptation of Slim's version as part of the civil rights movement in the 1960s.
I believe the first version of it, which he used as his template to make the popular Wobbly, was about the idea of the girls, like the character in that song, the girls go wild over me, and that's the whole subject matter of the song. And so that Slim is clearly choosing that song sarcastically, in the sense of, instead of, the girls are going wild over the man, it's the cop and the judge and the jailer, and the bed bugs and the fleas. So I think that was clearly just commentary on, he's taking some popular thing that he probably didn't think had much substance to it, and is trying to turn it around in a way that makes it, gives, playing with the meaning that was originally there around, this, oh, all the girls just won't stay away from me. And, so it's sarcastic, oh, the cops, they just won't leave me alone. And the judge, it's like, he just goes wild over me. So, I think that's, where Slim was coming from, perhaps. As for the other versions, I mean, during the civil rights era, it seems that it did have uh, uh, that the song kind of reemerged during the maybe the '60s. So in that version, there was some new lyrics that were added in. And yeah, I think that my sense was that during that period, they're invoking the song to speak to the jailing of all the civil rights activists that were going on. Which, yeah, I mean, I think I think that's beautiful that the song, if a song has life, it's an amazing thing if a song lives for more than a few years, and outliving the songwriter is, that's a song that's got some longevity, and so I think it's a testament to the song that it did resurface in the '60s, and yeah, I hope maybe it'll get out there a little bit more these days as well. I mean, to me, just the vibe of the song it's just a really beautiful, this kind of sense of this character who's never done any harm to anybody, not trying to cause anybody any trouble, and just getting thrown in, everybody's just going wild over him. And so I find that just image to be poignant, at just a basic human level, of this idea of, that this exists, that there's human beings that are not trying to cause anybody any harm, but just get caught up by these systems that are in place and locked away. Yeah, I think unfortunately the song is very relevant. That character does have this kind of innocence or naivety, maybe. And then there's also these lines, where he talks about the judge went wild over me, and I plainly saw that we never could agree. So I let the man obey what his conscience had to say. I love that line, that he let the man obey. Like, what? So I just let him obey what his conscience had to say. I'm not gonna. I don't know. He's easygoing too. Like, it's like, I'd hate to disturb the poor man's conscience. Like, no, I'll just let him say what he has to say, and he'll go wild over me. There's yeah, I think it really is it's a beautiful, beautiful song. And the last verse, the roses growing wild, will the roses grow wild over me when I'm gone into the land that is to be, when my soul and body part? In the stillness of my heart, will the roses grow wild over me? I think that's a beautiful, beautiful line. And there's a longing. It really expresses a longing, that I think is really beautiful.
So yeah, so this is my version of that song, the popular wobbly. I'm as mild-mannered as can be, and I've never done them any harm that I can see. But on me they put a ban, and they threw me in the can. They go wild, simply wild over me. They accuse me of rascality, but I can't see why they always pick on me. I'm as gentle as a lamb, but they take me for a ram. They go wild, simply wild over me. Oh, the bull, he went wild over me, and he held his gun where everyone could see. Breathing rather hard when he saw my Union card. He went wild, simply wild over me. Then the judge, he went wild over me, and I plainly saw we never could agree. So I let the man obey what his conscience had to say. He went wild, simply wild over me. Then the jailer, he went wild over me, and he locked me up and threw away the key. Yes, it seems to be the rage, so they keep me in a cage. They go wild, simply wild over me. They go wild, simply wild over me. I'm referring to the bedbug and the flea. They disturb my slumber deep, and I murmur in my sleep. They go wild, simply wild over me. Will the roses grow wild over me when I'm gone into the land that is to be? When my soul and body part in the stillness of my heart, will the roses grow wild over me? When my soul and body part in the stillness of my heart, will the roses grow wild over me?
Thank you. Thank you. The later years of Slim's life would see the declining fortunes of the IWW, leading him to note in 1937 with a typically grim witticism that we have the union, but no membership. This decline of the union to which he dedicated himself for so long was compounded by a life which was becoming increasingly difficult as old age, decades of hard manual labour and poverty all took their toll.
He settles down in the mid-1930s in New York City. He gets a job as a barge captain, working on the Manhattan waterfront. There's an account of that says that sometimes he would sleep aboard ship, and sometimes he would stay in flop houses in the Bowery, and the Lower East Side. He was certainly always poor. You don't stay in a flop house if you've got money. There's letters in the Westmoreland family archive that are in the possession of John and Cherie Westmoreland, where he's asking for money. There's also letters where he's giving money too, and letters that show he had some physical ailments as well, problems with his feet and so on. He's settled down, but he lives a pretty hard life, really, and obviously as he's getting older, it's even harder, right? So he's in his 50s, at this point, and there's evidence that his life was difficult, and just a few weeks ago, Cherie and John Westmoreland and myself, we were in New York City. And we discovered that Slim was arrested in 1939 for disorderly conduct, which indicates that maybe there's a kind of lessening of control, personally happening. And then towards the end of the very, very end of his life, there's a couple of mysteries, really. So his weekly columns basically pretty much stop appearing in the final 10 months of his life, or almost completely. So he, between 1920 and 1941, he is published in the Industrial Worker, as far as I can tell, pretty much every week, with occasional exceptions to that. Between July 1941 and his death in May 1942. His articles appear in only 6 of 45 issues. So there's a massive shift. There's obviously a number of possible explanations, that could be the case for this. Could be ill health. It could be trouble with the law. It could be something else. And anything, I was to say about that, I guess would only be speculation. But, I guess it's clear that there are lots of questions that are still there with Slim, and hopefully one day we may get some more answers.
The second mystery relates to the causes of Slim's death in May 1942.
I mean, what we know is that T-Bone Slim, his body was found in the East River on May 15th, 1942, and that it was estimated that his body, according to the medical examiner's report, it was estimated that he was in the water for about 4 days. And it has him listed officially as an unknown white male, approximate age of 50 years old, and that it said probable name of Matt Huta.
So it looks like he was probably informally identified by someone, but again, we don't know who. This, pretty mysterious demise, has led to some speculation. There's been, some speculation that he might have been murdered.
I mean, there's been stories that he was drunk and fell off the barge or fell off the docks. But I mean, I'd say that's, and then there's been at least a couple folks that have commented that they thought that he was murdered. I mean, it could be, who knows? I think it's really kind of speculative, no matter what.
Speculation about the possibility of Slim's murder forms a curious part of a novel called Savage Streets by Floyd Miller. A former New York seaman and member of the Communist Party, Miller had been gathering intelligence for the KGB in the 1930s and 40s on non-communist trade unionists active on the New York waterfront. Though primarily focused on Trotskyists, Miller would no doubt have been collecting information about wobblies like Slim as well. Miller's novel begins with the death of a, quote, philosophical wobbly who drowns in the river in what transpires to be a murder involving the mafia and the Communist Party itself. John goes into more detail about these intriguing connections with Slim's mysterious death in our bonus episode, available now for Patreon supporters. Meanwhile, following his death, Slim would fade almost immediately into complete obscurity.
It's kind of mysterious to me why he just kind of faded away very quickly after his death. I mean, the IWW did print an obituary for him, but it was about almost 6 months after his death had happened. And there doesn't seem to have been any other remembrances of him after that. I mean, he was, as best as I can tell, he was quite known in those, in those particular radical circles at the time, because his columns were widely read in certainly in the IWW circles, and judging from people like Carl Cowell, it sounds like in communist circles and things too, that that people in various unions would have been reading his material. Now, they may not have quoted his work because he's from a competing union. It's kind of fascinating that, I mean, I guess there is this mystique about T-Bone Slim, that he was this character that nobody really knew. And, the people that I've come across quotes from that, say that they knew him, basically in the same breath say that they didn't know him. I mean, it's like, yeah, I knew him, but nobody really knew him. And so that's interesting to see. I mean, it sounds, people have said that he was soft-spoken, and kept to himself. So I'm really not sure what to make of it. It's the way things have gone down.
He was buried on Hart Island. So Hart Island is an island off Manhattan. So a few miles away from Manhattan. He was buried on the 5th of June, 1942, as an unknown white man. Hart Island is America's biggest mass grave, basically. It's basically a potter's field where people who are too poor to afford private burials have been buried ever since the 19th century. He would have been buried by inmates of a workhouse that was on the island at the time that he died. So, it seems, fairly appropriate or poignant, I guess, that, he's somebody who wrote with America's poorest citizens in mind, and then he ends up being buried by them. He was a really, a genuinely great working class author. He's extremely talented, and he's been totally erased from literary history. And, it seems to me, well, we need to rediscover that history, and I think that rediscovery is an inherently political project. And he's a writer who is, he is talented enough that he will bear the pressure of scrutiny and analysis. And that's why we need more people to look at him. And, not just scholars. I can imagine all kinds of uses for him. I can imagine artists, I can imagine activists using Slim in their work. Obviously, John Westmoreland is going to be creating an album, of Slim's, unrecorded songs largely. Slim he's funny, he's punchy, he's sarcastic, he's ironic. He's accessible, he's experimental, and he never sold out. And he's not perfect, but I think we have a lot that we can get out of his work. And I think now is the time. He's been completely forgotten for 3/4 of a century, and now is the time to rediscover him.
He was breathing rather hard when he saw my Union car. He went wild, simply wild over me.
That's the end of our first episode of the Working Class Literature podcast. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed making it and talking to our guests. Links with more info on Slim and the IWW, as well as John Westmoreland's music, can be found in the show notes below. You can also find a link to the Working Class History online shop to buy a copy of the IWW's Little Red Songbook, which contains some of the songs discussed in this episode. If you liked what you heard, do consider donating something to our Patreon, as that will keep us sustainable and hopefully allow us to make episodes more frequently in future. Patrons will get exclusive early access to future episodes and can also listen to bonus content, such as the one for this episode containing readings by John of 2 of Slim's unpublished poems, as well as more on the peculiarities surrounding Slim's death. And if you can't donate anything right now, that's fine too, but if you could give us a great review on your favourite podcast app, that would be amazing as well. Anyway, that's it for today, and thanks for listening.